Yes, Cookie, I know Jamie Foxx is very talented, but you know what his Trump impression is? That thing you left on the sidewalk that I picked up. That's basically what it is. Oh, hey guys! Welcome back to JL's Book Club, where we don't talk about Fight Club because I didn't read Fight Club. Before we get to this month's new book, which took me a little while because the day job has been kicking my ass, and the book was fairly long, we have a new sponsor this month. Tap water. Newark says it's now safe to drink again. Tap water. Now this month's book, which is getting in just under the wire, it basically took me June and July to read, is called The Ministry for the Future by Kim Stanley Robinson. Don't you ever want to say Robertson? Well, it's Robinson, okay? Put some respect on his or her or they's name, okay? It's actually a he. We did that joke last month for the 9 of you that watch these glorious book reviews. He's a he. I think he identifies as a he, so we're going to call Kim a he. And this is a critically acclaimed book that I was reading an article in the New Yorker. Sorry, a little fancy. And they referred to this book. It was about this author, and I didn't read the whole article. I just got like 3 paragraphs in, but they say many people think he's written the best fiction book on climate change. And I said, well, that sounds like something I'd be interested in because I want to read more fiction. Recently read in an article that my suspicions about fiction writing were true, where reading fiction is one of the many ways to help offset dementia. Did I mention that reading fiction is one of the best ways to offset dementia? Anyway, I stopped reading the article after that, but I thought, let's give this a try. And their big credit on the cover is one of Barack Obama's favorite books of the year, that year being 2020. And I thought, okay, let's read some fiction about climate change. Now, off the top, I will say, this book reads more like a report. Like it feels like history, almost. It feels like a chronicle of things that have already happened, except it's taking place in the future. This is obviously a writer who is extremely well steeped in science and knows what he's talking about, which gives the book a much greater feeling of terror and inevitability than maybe just any other book. And it's the theme of the climate change books I've read recently. There was, I'm looking at the bookshelf to remind me, but there was the book by David Wallace Wells, The Uninhabitable Earth, which was genuinely terrifying. And then there was The Water Will Come by Jeff Goodell, who's a writer for Rolling Stone, which was fantastic, which really only focuses on like coastal flooding and things like that. But basically, there is no happy climate change book. They're all terrifying. I think Jordan Peele should do a climate change horror movie, because M. Night Shyamalan fucked that up with The Happening, one of the worst movies ever made. But I think a climate change horror movie would be pretty cool in a terrifying way. Hopefully better than They, Them, which is a conversion camp horror movie on Peacock right now, which is one of the worst pieces of shit I've ever seen. So, this book, it starts, I'm going to give you a couple passages and we'll describe, and I'll give you my final review on the book, because I know you may be thinking I'm going to give it a glowing review, but there's some issues I take with this book. But the opening chapter takes place in India. Fairly warm place, if you're familiar. Sorry, I read a lot. I happen to know that India is super hot. And one of our characters, this is just the end of chapter 1. There's a heat wave in India. It's, I believe, the year 2024. But this train of thought was like scratching an itch and thereby making it worse. He tasted the hot lake water, tasted how foul it was, filled with organics and who knew what. Poop. Still, he had a thirst that couldn't be slaked. Hot water in one's stomach meant that there was no refuge anywhere. The world, both inside and outside, well higher than human body temperature ought to be. They were being poached. Surreptitiously, he uncapped his water jug and drank. Its water was now tepid, but not hot, and it was clean. His body craved it, and he couldn't stop himself. He drank it all down. People were dying faster than ever. There was no coolness to be had. All the children were dead. All the old people were dead. People murdered what should have been screams of grief. Who could still move? Those who could still move shoved bodies out of the lake or out toward the middle where they floated like logs, or sank. Frank shut his eyes and tried not to listen to the voices around him. He was fully immersed in the shallows. "Tell me something, girl," and could rest his head back against the concrete edge of the walkway and the mud just under it, sink himself until he was stuck in mud and only half his head exposed to the burning air. Now, if you don't know what the fuck I just did there, it's okay. There was a small indie film that made $300 million and was nominated for Best Picture called A Star is Born. And the hit song that won an Oscar from that movie was called In the Shallow. And so when I saw Shallows, I thought, let me do a little impromptu Bradley Cooper song. Anywho, that's the first chapter, a heat wave in India that we find out kills 20 million people. So that's sort of a catalyst. That's where, and the scary thing about that is you're going, wow, that's terrible, but that couldn't happen. But then as I was reading the book, more and more things happen, and here's the creepiest one, okay, the creepiest passage I'm going to read to you. It takes place, it's about halfway through the book, it takes place in Los Angeles. And this is just, and the way the book is written, it's almost like it follows, 9, 10, 12 different threads of people experiencing different aspects, whether it's refugee crisis, scientists in Antarctica figuring out how to cool the glaciers, sort of the Ministry for the Future is a sort of international government body, which is obviously very critical in the book. Sort of if there's a main story, it's that one. It follows a guy who had post-traumatic stress and becomes sort of an eco-terrorist after the India heat wave in chapter 1. So it's following many different things. And at first you're like, wow, this is really, really like good and a little bit scary, but oh, what a good book. But then you start to realize, I think this guy has researched all this stuff. This is like what scientists think will actually happen. This isn't like him pulling this out of his Kim Stanley Robinson ass. And then literally, when I was reading this chapter a week or two ago, I'll tell you why it's super scary. I looked out my front door and saw cars floating down the street on a brown wave about 3 feet high that covered everything. I could see the water was already coming into my landlord's house and rushing hard towards the 210. Everywhere I looked was a big sheet of brown water. I shouted to my landlord, but he had already left without informing me. Very typical. Look at this chick. Even during an apocalypse, she's like bitching about men. In fact, I couldn't see anyone anywhere except for a family on top of their SUV, getting taken for a sideways ride and looking desperate. I got down my outside stairs and sloshed through brown water to the garage side door. Inside, I found the power had gone out, of course, so it was a struggle to get the big garage door open. I managed to pull it up from inside, and a sloosh of water flowed into the garage, a little wave about a foot high. But there was my kayak, and I grabbed it and the paddle off the wall, wriggled into the skirt and got into the kayak, and took off into the street. Now, the reason I read that passage is a day or two after I read that part in the book, that chapter, there was a front page article on the New York Times predicting a massive, massive flood in California. Like a 30-day storm that will like decimate the city and cause like $1 trillion, if not more, dollars in damage. So this book was published in 2020, probably written in 2018. And I thought to myself, okay, well that adds an extra layer of scariness because obviously this guy, all these things I've been reading in this book are probably informed deeply by science and consensus in the science community with some variables. But then as you're reading, it causes you to like revisit everything you've read so far and go, is there going to be a heat wave in India that kills millions of people? I guess maybe that's possible now and maybe even likely. Scary stuff. So like a lot of apocalyptic movies and things, I think the first half of the book where they're describing all these horrible things happening, I don't want to call it exciting, but it does give you this kind of rush as you're reading like this fictional book because you're like, oh my God, this is terrible. Like you're feeling emotions. And then the book kind of, handles certain policy, like it gets into nuts and bolts of policy. This guy is obviously super smart and maybe too well-versed for a readable fiction book because like I said, there are parts of this book where I'm like, wow. Then there's parts where he gets into the personal lives of characters and like very rich, detailed descriptions of places in Scandinavia and stuff where you're just kind of reading it going, it's kind of a letdown. because I'm just reading about like 9 apocalyptic events and eco-terrorist acts, and then it's like, the lights above the seascape in Scandinavia were pink, almost orange, and I'm like, okay, like, can we move on? I get it, 3 pages to describe the sky or whatever. So some of it, and maybe some people will like that rich description, but it's almost, the contrast is almost too much because you're reading some chapters that are breezing by, and you're like, holy shit, this is like terrifying and exciting in a sad way. And you want to see how, if anything gets resolved, if they're able to resolve it. But the only other scary thing, which is not really eco-related, but he describes a thing. One chapter is like a character who gets one chapter who's in the U.S. Navy. And this is just the part. And I couldn't find the exact passage I wanted, but this is related to it. A couple more things about the Navy. Now that Pebble Mob missiles exist, none of our ships could survive an attack by hostiles who have such systems. It just wouldn't work. Nothing can stop those. You don't have to have gone to Annapolis to figure this out. The upper brass don't talk about it. No one talks about it because it would be too mind-boggling. Would you just throw in the towel, say, whoops, we are now like the cavalry, or flint-tipped spears, or a sharp rock in the hand? No, not right away, you wouldn't say that. So what it means is that the submarine fleet is all we've got in a real war. Since the threat from submarines is nuclear, as in atomic end-of-the-world kind of stuff, hopefully they won't ever be used. So in practical terms, until the subs rearm, maybe with pebble mobs of their own, I wouldn't doubt that that has even happened already. As a military force, the Navy has been completely taken off the table. All navies have. In any real war, the whole surface fleet would soon be on the bottom. Not a happy thought. No, not a happy thought. Pebble mob missiles are, in the description of this author, and probably the scariest thing of everything I read in this book, just because I'm like, well, if 8 of these things are true, I guess maybe this is also a technology people are working on. The idea of pebble mob missiles is that they can't be deflected by defense shields or other weapons because they get sent in the form of like thousands or millions of tiny objects that only coalesce right as they reach the target. So you can't stop them. Now, if that's something we're fucking developing right now, we or any country, what the fuck are we doing? Is it all over? Cookie didn't like the F-bomb. Sorry, Cooks. But this is the kind of stuff. So if you there are aspects of this book which feel like essential and terrifying, and that you kind of read and go, is this the future we're headed towards? Because it's scary. And like I said, there's parts in this book where like we reach a point where eco-terrorism, they're poisoning cows, they're shooting down commercial jets because they're saying basically fossil fuels and methane have to be stopped because at this point they are killing society. And the beginning of the book, this mega heat wave in India is the catalyst for so much, because obviously 20 million people, that's like how many Russia lost in World War II, and they lost it in a heat wave in this book. And it makes you think, like, at what point do we get pushed until this becomes like righteous violence? And that's why the book, I think, is such a well-regarded, important piece of literature. Now, the negatives, folks, like I said, once they get too heavy into the personal lives of characters, I'm sort of like, I get it, you're writing a novel, but like, you're hitting me with the hammer, and then you're like, okay, now let's take 8 pages to discuss her dating life. Let's not say we did Kim Stanley Robinson. There's obviously a deep appreciation of nature by this guy. Overall, it's a very good book. I see why it's such an important book. I don't consider it some sort of flawless book, but that might just be my experience reading it, sort of the highs and lows. You get jacked up during so many chapters, and then other chapters you're like, why did this chapter take me an hour to read? It's only 7 pages. And then you're breezing through stuff like, the world's coming to an end. Ooh, what a juicy page turner. So maybe that's me. Maybe I'm a sick human being. But I think I would recommend it. No, I would recommend it. Why am I saying I'm here? I would recommend it. But it's definitely better than the fantasy book I reviewed a few months ago. Okay, in this book there's a lot of violence, but none of it involves using blood as lubricant for anal sex. Go back and watch that review if you haven't. If you're new to the Patreon, Red Wolf, Black Leopard, or Black Leopard, Red Wolf. Don't recommend the book, but I recommend the book review. But yeah, overall, I see, I think Obama might have been, kind of trying to seem a little too farty for his own good, saying it's one of my favorite books because it's important. But I would recommend it. It's a paperback. It's, Jesus Christ, $18. I paid $18 for this thing. No, it's, if what I've said interests you, if you're interested in the topic, which we all should be, go get it. If not, rent it from the library, borrow it from the borrow it from the library. Then you don't pay any money for it. And then you can't blame me if you're like, JL, I spent $23 Canadian on this book, you son of a bitch. Sorry, didn't mean to curse, because Canadians are nice. So, that's this month's book. Take it or leave it. I say that's an overall positive review, but, I can't act like it. The reason it took so long is because there were parts that sped through, and then other parts I was like, I only read 5 pages today because I wasn't getting into it. So take it for what it's worth. It's almost 600 pages, so it's not a short book. But next month's book, guys, is the 2021 Pulitzer Prize winner for general nonfiction. So they get the first word on whether it's a good book, but I'll have the last word. Wilmington's Lie by David Zucchino or Zucchino. We'll find out before next month how to pronounce his last name. But it won the 2021 Pulitzer Prize for general nonfiction. Full title, Wilmington's Lie, The Murderous Coup of 1898 and the Rise of White Supremacy. So it's like the exact thing that they wanted to happen on January 6th, except it happened. But we'll see. I'm excited to read it. I've heard great things. It came highly recommended by my brother, journalist, esteemed thought leader, Henri Cauvin. So that's next month. So thanks for watching. Thanks for being Patreon subscribers. And remember, guys, books, they're like documentaries for smart people.